on. It's on, so I'm going to assume I'm going into the record. All right. Good evening, everybody. I'm Carl Lestrito. I'm the director of the School of Architecture. I want to take a moment before I get into the introduction to welcome any students for whom this is your first lecture. I won't be awkward about it and ask you to raise your hand or anything, but I know you are here. You'll probably remember these lectures. I remember the lecture series when I were in school. They will affect you. They will have a tangible and meaningful impact and a direct impact on your own work if you let them. And if you engage in these lectures in an active way. My favorite way to do that is to assume it's my job to ask a question, and then listen, and then be crafting questions as you're sketching in your sketchbook. But again, these lectures are for you, and so I'll just sort of say now, hint, hint, that I'm looking forward to your questions at the end of this lecture. I'm here tonight on behalf of Dean Jason Young and the College of Architecture and Design Programming Committee, whose members are Christopher Coate, Julie Kress, Scott A. McDaniel, and Mark Stanley, who's the chair. I'm thankful that the committee offered me the opportunity to welcome Jeffrey Huber formally, in part because the planning of and support for this lecture was a collaborative endeavor between the college and AIA East Tennessee. AIA, in my short time at UT, it's been clear to me that AIA East Tennessee is not a typical local AIA chapter. Case in point, John Sanders, their programming committee chair. He was the driving force for bringing Jeffrey to Knoxville, and he's really taken on the lecture series as a multi-year project. I also want to acknowledge and thank Jen McMahon, the AIA East Tennessee component executive, Josh Schaffner, the chapter president, and Chad Bocher, who I think might be here as well. Chad is also on the AIA East Tennessee Programming Committee. Okay, so there's an elephant in the room, which is Jeffrey grew up in Florida and went to University of Gainesville. Yeah, okay, calm down, everybody. I wasn't necessarily going to mention this, but Jason was with me, so he can attest that this is true. We were at the football game, as some of you might have been, and we rode up the elevator with a young man, maybe 8 years old, and his father, and there's somebody in a Florida vivid blue polo, and the father, I presume, of this very young child says, "Look who's here with us in the elevator, son." Maybe he used his exact name. And I thought, oh, what a teachable moment. This is going to be a beautiful thing. The kid is going to say hi, and he's going to, the gentleman from Florida they're going to shake hands, going to say good luck. No, the kid flips the Florida guy the bird immediately. The elevator laughs. It's a little awkward. Teachable moment does not happen. Elevator keeps moving slowly. The gentleman from Florida says, ha-ha, and then the elevator ride mercifully ends. So I'm grateful that we get to do the opposite kind of welcome for you today as mature adults who can use the academic discourse that we live in to not let SEC rivalries get in the way of our camaraderie. But I also want to note one thing similar about University of Florida and UT is that they have a strong culture around their building. And Jeffrey has worked on, imagine how difficult this would be, working on the addition and renovation of the building that is near and dear to your alma mater's heart, right? So that does give us a sense that Jeff doesn't run from problems, like he runs toward the problems. But I also want to note, back on script now, that while my position as School of Architecture sees me thinking about architecture and architects all the time, it's fitting that our first lecture of this academic year will be presenting work that aligns with how we see the design disciplines here in the college, interrelated, mutually provocative, and with porous boundaries. In that spirit, I'd first like to note that Jeffrey is the Director of Architecture, Urban Design, and Planning at Brooks Scarpa. He's one of 3 principals, along with Lawrence Scarpa and Angela Brooks. He co-leads the collaborative practice, which is anchored in both Los Angeles and South Florida, the latter of which is the studio that he directs. In 2014, Brooks Scarpa was honored with the Smithsonian Cooper Hewitt National Design Award for Architecture. Brooks Scarpa described themselves as a collective of designers with a multidisciplinary practice that includes architecture, landscape architecture, planning, environmental design, materials research, graphic, furniture, and interior design services that produces innovative, sustainable, iconic buildings and urban environments. Good quote. The Cooper Hewitt Award is a high honor both because of its status, history, and legacy, and because it was conceived to honor achievement in American design, and it honors practices collectively as opposed to honoring specific individuals or practices. One of Brooks Scarpa's guiding principles, along with environmental stewardship and design excellence, is an explicit focus on process. We talk here about the meta moment, and to use a quote from Dean Young, how we can make a design education vivid. And in that sense, I think it's clear that what Jeffrey Huber and others at Brooks Scarpa have done is make the design process vivid for clients and communities. It's a great lesson in that the explicit reflection on how we design leads to meaningful discourse about why we design. Perusing their large and diverse body of work might lead one to assume incorrectly, I think, that there is an architect behind the work that fancies themselves a star. I want to pause here and note that Jeffrey has signed a copy of the latest book about Brooks Scarpa. This is for us, all of us at the school and college. I'll leave this up in the admin suite for a while, so you can feel free to enjoy it. When Jeffrey signs a book, you get a sketch. You can see the sketch. They're not all the same. I know this because Mark Stanley's sketch is different. And I don't want to describe the project. This one has a sketch of the Heron Senior Housing Project in Miami Beach. I assume it'll be part of tonight's lecture. But it's a beautiful example of the pedagogical range of Jeffrey's work and the work of Brooks Scarpa. On one hand, we could have a conversation about the role of randomness, scale, gradients, interior-exterior ambiguity, and the reoccurring formal condition, if one can call it that, in Brooks Scarpa's work that sees the confident assertion of the rectilinear volume met with a refusal to accept the singular expression of the box. The curves on the surface of the facade are in dialogue with those in another project that Jeffrey led, the Youth Sports Fieldhouse. But clearly this is not a motif. This is design research that intersects form, technology, material, and process. The exterior makes a statement, to be sure, but it wills you to enter rather than imposing itself. This reminds me of another Brooks Scarpa housing project that I think a lot about called the 6 Disabled Veteran Housing Project in LA. The project is so named because the building is literally meant to have your back, or have one's back. Form intersects climate, intersects justice, intersects ecology, intersects citizenship, intersects service. This brings me to another key intersection in Jeffrey's career, the intersection between practice and academia. He holds an associate professorship at Florida Atlantic University, where he recently won the William McGinn Award for Outstanding Architectural Education Contributions. This is the highest award an architecture professor can receive from AIA Florida. In the words of their director, Joseph Choma, and just so you know, all directors of all School of Architecture have a constant dialogue. That's not true at all. But I know Joseph. He says, and I quote, "Jeff's work embraces the pragmatic constraints as poetic design opportunities," end quote. I know from doing my own research, not just from talking to Joseph, which means I looked at his Instagram, that he gets excited about his students learning to draw just as much he gets excited about capturing the formwork coming down from a construction site. In other words, you're right at home here, I think. We can look back at Jeff's early career with the University of Arkansas Community Design Center, part of the Fay Jones School of Architecture and Design, to understand the seeds of his current practice. For him and his colleagues there, the impact of design doesn't stop at the expense of the building, and education didn't stop at the studio. More recently and relatedly, Jeffrey authored an AIA white paper, A Public Good, reintroducing agriculture production into the design of cities. This is designed to spur action. As we'll hear and see a bit today with respect to housing, this kind of research affects in very measurable ways our built environment. When things get meta for Jeffrey, they don't become abstract. It's actually quite the opposite. They become very specific, measurable, and operable. The report, which I know is meaningful to a lot of studios and students here, perhaps going into self-directed project or the MAP project dealing with farming in the city, it addresses myths, articulates benefits, and without prescribing solutions is immediately actionable. Okay, so I apologize for mentioning Jeffrey's Instagram before mentioning that he's a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. I understand a good Instagram and the F are about the same. I jest that they are not the same. There's some additional impressive facts that I don't want to go unsaid. He holds a master's degree and a license in both architecture and landscape architecture. His projects have won dozens of national design awards, including multiple progressive architecture awards, AIA National Institute Honor Awards in architecture and regional urban design, in architecture and regional urban design, American Society of Landscape Architects, and American Architecture Awards. He's authored book chapters, spoken at conferences, and his professional work has been published in hundreds of books and periodicals. In addition to the schools already mentioned, Jeffrey has also taught at the University of Florida, Mississippi State University, and the University of Southern California. I'm so grateful he's here. Please join me in formally welcoming him.
Thank you. I do have one. I think you can hear me. So I don't know to answer this with a ha-ha, like a middle finger, but that was a great introduction. I do appreciate it, Carl. Yeah. As my wife says, I'm a legend in my own mind, I guess. No, I'm really honored to be here tonight and honored to be invited, and I really appreciated spending the day in your building with all the colleagues here as well as the students. And so, you know, I'm here to share some of our work, a little bit about our passion, as Carl just kind of indicated. Hopefully I meet the task, because that was again, a great introduction. In the conversations I've had today, I do have to kind of say, I'm going to deviate a little bit from just talking about housing. So I'll probably start out with talking a little bit about that, but I want to kind of also talk and touch on other aspects of the kind of metadisciplinary practice that we have and how we kind of think about that. Most of you may or may not know about our office, but as Carl mentioned, we're headquartered in Los Angeles. We also have an office in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Between both offices, we're only 25 people. So we have a bit of it's a small office with a big mission, I'd like to say. And I should also add that my partners this year were honored with the 2022 gold medal from AIA too, and that was an incredible honor for our firm to be awarded that, and both of them to be honored. Angie's only the third woman to ever been honored with that award, and I think we need to see more diversity, more inclusion, and more things as we broaden this profession, especially in its challenges that it's going to be having and facing over the next 100 years. So I'm really excited today to speak with you. And I wanted to start out, talking a little bit about where we came as an office. Most people know our firm around housing, but it wasn't always what our firm did. Our firm's been around for 30 years. This was our first housing project we did. It was in 2000. It's called Colorado Court. and it was actually the first LEED multifamily project in the country. We actually spearheaded with Angie, specifically spearheading LEED and other aspects on this project. We got a tremendous amount of exposure on this, and we really had to question some of those aspects, but I want to just play a short video.
It is nearly 100% independent from the power grid. It was built by an architect who specializes in...
A new building that is energy conscious is now going up in Santa Monica, and it's getting a lot of attention. Channel 4's Patrick Healy is there.
At first, it appears to be any new apartment project, just another building noisily being put up on a Santa Monica corner lot. But Colorado Court is in the...
One of Leo's personal passions is finding out ways to provide environmentally safe housing to low-income families. Take a look.
We're standing here at the first green affordable housing project in the country. This is Larry Scarpa, the architect. Why don't you...
You get the picture, right? I mean, it was kind of tremendous that it got a lot of this attention for what was one of the first affordable housing projects in the city of Santa Monica. And, we were really investigating this kind of tight, kind of micro unit development before micro units even became a kind of fad and a thing. But this was the best way that we could build affordability. Interestingly enough, this building was designed to be completely off the grid. 100% of its energy needs were produced through the building. Most of them, or I guess most of it through a micro turbine on the roof, about 20 to 30% of it through these PV panels. But, if you know about how to design in a passive way, I mean, that was the first strategy we had here. Anybody ever heard of alphabet buildings, right? We used to design buildings before that, predating air conditioning, in the alphabetic shapes as plans. And this is just one of those kind of buildings, and the building has 0 AC in it. It is actually only about 2 blocks off of the ocean, so that's one of the beauties of working in California that I don't quite have in Florida. We have a little bit more humidity and a little bit more heat in Florida. But this building was really designed to kind of shade itself, to create a brise-soleil. Here's that kind of alphabet shape. So this one was formed in this E pattern. We always think about sustainability and these kind of integrated practices that our buildings should develop in them. So you see the photovoltaic systems, but also this kind of shading, the way that we could harvest rainwater, and thinking about that and stewarding that on the site, as well as materiality and other aspects. But at the end of the day, we really asked ourselves, how is our building, the one that's here on the right, the one on the left is not our building, but how is it different than something like that on the left? How is it different than a bedroom warehouse? That really, how are we facing the street? How are we creating a character, a building that actually goes ahead and begins to integrate itself, as well as becomes a steward of creating a built environment and a public realm worth designing for? I mean, that was the huge challenge, but it was the way that the codes, the way regulations, and all of these things that get in the way sometimes of our design got in the way of this project. Even though we were doing the best things, it won all of these awards. And so Larry and Angie, interestingly enough, formed a non-for-profit organization called Livable Places, where they actually started writing policies to begin to think about how do we capture and adapt the built environment to begin to, one, allow for something more than just a single family residence, but also how do we begin to think and plan for the town, a kind of townscaping? How do we begin to look at walkability, livability concerns, and how do we begin to integrate those? And it's great because now that ordinance was passed, which was called the Small Lot Ordinance, and it's really taken on this characteristic of all these other architects. Again, these are not our buildings, but these are buildings that have been built based on that new policy and regulation there in Los Angeles. And then that became a model in HUD, the Housing and Urban Group Department went ahead and calls this its best practices, and has touted it as best practices for mid-range density across the country. But that wasn't enough for our firm. Really what we wanted to also engage in with Maurice Cox, as well as several others, including Katie Swinson, who used to be with the Enterprise Foundation and is now with Mass Design Group, developed Affordable Housing Design Leadership Institute. And if anybody's ever heard of the Mayor's Institute on City Design, what this institute allows for is to bring 8 professionals or experts on affordable housing in together with developers to work on how do we sit and address the next phases of affordable housing, and how do we bake in better design. And what we wanted to always say as a firm is that design can be done on any budget. You know, I always found in school, like my professors would always say, well, don't worry about the budget now. You know, it's like, it doesn't matter because budgets are everything. And then when you get into the real world, as they call it, right, you know, you start practicing and budgets become everything. But one of the things that you have to learn as a student is that just because you're on a budget doesn't mean you can't actually design in a great way. It's just you have to learn how to spend 80% of the budget maybe on 20% of the project, that one thing that you're looking for, and how you would begin to celebrate that. And that's something that really comes through with design. And so this was mentioned, I'll mention the 6, which, you know, means I've got your back in military terms. But the 6 became one of these projects where we started to explore how do we have a better relationship with the city. How do we also, and these projects are challenging because this is for veterans disabled housing, but that's mentally and physically disabled. So in some cases, when you're dealing with mental disabilities, you don't always want to connect to the street. So again, there's this kind of dialectic that is opposed as well at the same time trying to connect. And so I'm just going to go ahead and play another video.
None of us at the end of a hard day at work say, I think I'm going to go to my housing unit after work. No one says that. People say, I'm going home. And hopefully the residents who have the opportunity to be in a home of their own, leaving a life of homelessness behind, hopefully they feel those same sorts of connections to what a home represents. People are always a little worried about an affordable housing building going in or a supportive housing building going in. And I think all too often homeless folks who have passed through various systems probably reflect the worst in design. This is the local welfare office. This is the local mental health office. This is the local probation office. At best, pretty utilitarian. At worst, spaces that communicate a very negative message to the people who engage in those spaces. And we think that's a model that should be changed. Design can be used creatively as a solution to ending homelessness, no matter where it exists. So this is a rectangular shaped building on a rectangular shaped lot. Nothing terribly unusual about it. Pretty commonplace actually when you think about it. But I think it says you can do something really imaginative and creative in terms of crafting that solution, even on a plain old apartment building lot. Angie mentioned that the facade of this building is actually a space, which is the first time I heard her describe it that way, and I thought, that is really pretty interesting. The facade is actually a space. This is a great looking building on this block, even without homeless folks in it. The fact that homeless people live here, I think, once again, promotes a very positive depiction of what supportive housing can and should look like, in my opinion.
I used to sneak in McDonald's and stuff, like after the restroom, and go in there and take a bath. My pride was really bad to just go and say I'm homeless. This building is marvelous. So I have family come visit. We have a community room. Like you want guests, your guests don't have to be inside your home. They can be inside the guest room, enjoy your company for a couple of hours, and send them on their merry way.
We created an aperture which was lifted up above the street so that it appears really open. There's a visual connection to the street, but not necessarily a physical connection.
You can come up on the roof and just relax your brains and get your thoughts out and make yourself better. This building right here will make you a better person.
So we're trying to it's really architectural critics. You know, the thing about this work too is that we're always looking at precedents, and courtyard housing in Los Angeles is absolutely fascinating. I mean, it's pretty fascinating in most tropical as well as kind of climate that Los Angeles has, in the sense that they really create a kind of cohesive unit. It's almost like this handshake measure, another layer that comes from the street to the home itself or to the unit. And so we're always looking at how do we layer space? How do you create these kind of handshakes? And so you're just seeing some of this incredible housing that's been done around Los Angeles, and how we're trying to kind of explore that, and how does that kind of build upon these new typologies that we're trying to develop that are really trying to serve a social good and a social need. If you know anything about Los Angeles, there's about 25,000 homeless people in Los Angeles, and it's a tremendous issue. Particular housing project, as you saw, is done for Trust, and is actually the first housing project they did out of Skid Row in the MacArthur Park district of Los Angeles. Again, we weren't doing anything really different except for how we look where breezes were coming through. How do we kind of create and promote this kind of cross or stacked ventilation, but also trying to maintain eyes on the street, as Jane Jacobs would always say in her canonical book. But that tie to the street, even though we could not have that, we learned a lot of lessons, and those lessons have begun to be built on and kind of permeated through the other projects as we're moving through, as I'll be showing tonight. But again, this is a typical kind of courtyard building. So you see that courtyard level plan here on the right, and the typical kind of floor plan to the left-hand side. There were some other things that we really learned, and you saw in the video, but inside the units, these are, again, only 350 to 400 square foot micro units. These are studio apartments, and in some cases we had some that were one bedroom. This is just happens to be one of the one bedroom examples. But there's also lessons that we learned from that Colorado Court project that I'm mentioning, or that I showed at the beginning, but just orienting windows in a vertical way from floor to ceiling actually made the spaces feel much bigger, much broader. And so those kind of lessons we take to all of our projects now, and kind of thinking through them. Also, we've kind of learned, and it's been adapted, and you can kind of see that even in LEED and other kind of green building platforms, that daylighting and in the see any more daylighting. So if you can kind of maintain and think about that design for daylighting. And I always ask this question, Larry does too, but how many people don't like daylight? Okay, good. How many of you don't like natural breezes and, I mean, it was incredible. I mean, you guys are so lucky here when I got out of the airport, because I was not going to be here on Saturday. I got out of the airport yesterday and walked into town and held my head down pretty low, but that's okay. I was pretty sure I knew what was going to happen. But it was really amazing, the fresh air, this kind of mountain air that you got when I kind of hit it's a very different thing when you're in these cities, or we are. It's like we're trying to go ahead and adapt and kind of making the buildings as wellness, or as promoters of trying to get better air quality, as well as harvesting those breezes as we can. Here's just some of those community spaces that were kind of shown on there in that courtyard space, where we're just looking at how does the building become a living room to the city, but also to the residents as a whole. And again, amplifying or expanding the modest square footage of the interior unit. Images. These are very simple buildings done on very simple budgets. I don't even want to give you what the budget is per square foot, but I can tell you it's very low. And the thing that we've learned in these affordable housing projects is they're pretty wickedly paid for, financed through federal funding, through state funding, through local funding. And those mechanisms all kind of play out. But when they have money in some of these projects, they set that budget, and at the end, sometimes there's more money left over. And what the client always comes to us is like, well, we have another $100,000. What can we do to it? So we always have these kind of plan Bs in the back of our pockets, what we can do and kind of provide. And so we were able to do some of these screens and other apertures that began to shade the front facade. But if you look on our website, you could actually see the courtyard had some other fins and architecture that we could look at. But we were also able to kind of add a green roof to the building, to the project. these little elements that you see, we think of like we're sculptors. You know, everything is really didactic and it's kind of controlled in there. And so these are actually the stacks for all the plumbing, are actually just kind of wrapped in these what look like figural elements. And so what you have is folks like the resident you saw, like going up there and stargazing at sometimes at the night and other elements. But that's just that there is a spot where they can meditate and kind of have and really have solace in these kind of zones. And so that's what that space really provides at that top. And so you can kind of see some screens. They don't have them, some of them they do. And these are some of the elements we were able to add back in once we realized we had some budgets or some money left over in the budget to do that. I'm going to talk about a little bit is the Cherokee Studio. And this is where we were really trying to experiment how you make an interesting kind of building. How can the building change and have this kind of ephemeral nature to it? And so just a simple kind of structure of these kind of screens that were louvered and kind of allowed for us to open and shut and close really created a kind of dynamic where the building could change over the course of a day, over the course of months, or over the course of the years, and opening up to also allow for that kind of ground floor, use kind of office or a commercial space could be in that ground floor. But these were, again, it's a courtyard building, what you don't see behind here, but there's lessons that we learned even on this one. We had a developer who was in a budget crunch at the time where we developed this project and just take the screen off. And so we said, okay, yeah, sure, we could take the screen off, and that's where all the architecture is. We showed him what it looked like. He said, wait, like we now, since we have all of this solar heat gain that's going to hit the building, we need to go back and redo our energy calculations. We actually found like it was going to cost us $300,000 to put this screen. It's both on the front and the back side. It's east and the west side. It actually cost us another $150,000 to upgrade the mechanical systems without that screen. And then there was some other added costs that were into it. So what the client ended up saying was like, geez, for $100,000 I get this, and so we actually were able to kind of show how you value architecture. That's the other aspect we always have in our projects is value engineering. What's called value engineering, but I always affectionately call it devalue engineering. I think it's like that aspect that we all have to thrive through as practice, but we figure out how do we tie two-for components, or how do we tie multiple things to some of these elements that we're integrating in the design of our buildings in order to preserve them as part of the design. And so these are just some of the floor plates. Again, you see that it's these, in this case, there were some single-story units and then some double-story units in there called masonettes with a kind of courtyard in the center. And then you can kind of see in the front and the back are those kind of porches that were covered by the screen. And this is just the kind of interior shot. What's interesting is you actually came up to the third floor on the unit, and then you went downstairs to go into your bedrooms. And so the other funny thing that we did in here was like we recycled skateboards for the backsplash of the kitchens. And so that was just kind of one of these fun elements where we're trying to recycle materials and kind of getting those integrated into here. So one of the things we were asked to by Skid Row Housing was to come back to them and innovate, and some of your challenges would be to modernize buildings. We were asked to modernize this building, which doesn't always have design, but we were trying to find whatever we could as a design option. And this was from the 1920s that was being utilized for affordable housing. And so it had these elements, these courtyards that we were really interested in, that those were those design opportunities of how could we, even though we were upgrading some of the mechanical equipment, we found these courtyards as that kind of primary space. And so this is one of them that we came into, which was really being used as bike storage, had some seating, but we to this, to where it really had still outdoor seating. And the things is, it was the fire egress. And so we were still able to work with the fire department to kind of get these stairs that up against that wall there, and then a gate to get outside. But it was a very simple kind of features that we were designing to get this into there, and really making it a kind of piece of furniture for the community. And now that they're heavily using it But it's become a kind of, again, another one of these kind of outdoor living rooms. And then there was another kind of slotted courtyard, which was really just a trash hole. Everybody was throwing trash from their units into this kind of space. This was where everybody went and smoked cigarettes, and even though they weren't allowed to smoke there, it was just a really dismal and trash collecting space. And you can actually see it's pretty tall, pretty dark and grim. And so we really trying to figure out what can we do to kind of begin to upgrade that. And so what we did was, first thing is kind of redo the ground to make it actually live seating areas, but to go ahead and paint it white and have to where these potted plants, we actually designed all of kind of hold. In each, there was as many units, there were potted plants. And what we were trying to do is make all the residents have one plant that they could kind of hang out. That didn't work so well. They found a few residents that would take care of all of them. But, you know, you can kind of see that we were trying to reorganize the bike racks and other elements in here, and just really through very small means exploring opportunities in this project, and to the point where there was also a collective cooking area, this commercial kitchen that we went ahead and revamped as well. And you can kind of see that last courtyard I was showing through the doors there. So all of this really created this kind of communal space and opportunities that they could then leverage and kind of use. And now it's heavily used, it's loved space, and so it's become more popular and not so much garbage being thrown into it anymore. So a project that we just recently finished is called the Rose Apartments, and it's 35 units, and this is actually done for transitional aged youth. If you're not familiar with that term, you know, the issue that we have in homelessness is the homeless population isn't always adults. It's a lot of children, especially under the age of 18, that are going and homeless, and they transition from 18 to 25. There's a lot of housing that's now being designed that's called TAY, or this transitional aged youth housing. And so this was 35 units for families that were young families that were this traditional age youth, 18 to 25 years of age, that we were building in Venice. And so I'm just going to show another quick video.
Doing affordable housing does not just happen overnight. Rose Apartments is, first of all, the first ground-up construction that has happened in Venice in over 20 years. The second thing is that Rose Apartments is 100% supported, and that is a huge deal in the city of LA. Rose Apartments is going to house 35 families. Half would be for families and individuals who are experiencing homelessness. There are folks in the community that don't want developments like this to happen. They have a lot of perception about unhoused people, you know, living on the street currently and how they transition into housing. They have a lot of negative thoughts and ideas of who are living in our buildings, and these things are just not true. We're excited to be able to give some unhoused folks that opportunity to, you know, live by the water and experience the beach. To have the same experiences as everyone else in Venice.
So I was always fascinated that you had this thing, NIMBYism. I never heard of bananas until we went to these public or these community meetings here on this project, where it was just like not in my backyard, just amplified to build nothing anywhere at any time. You know, this was kind of that quintessential project that she was saying. There's been nothing in Venice Beach built in the last 20 years from ground up. It's all primarily been renovation work. And so this was a key project for us with this particular housing authority to build these units. They had their office spaces on this previously. And so we were really trying to figure out, how do we begin to think about the same kind of idea of tying to the street? How do we create a kind of mixed-use building that also kind of houses a very specific teenage or transitional youth population that had the same kind of disabilities, both mental and physical possibly, and have had years of homelessness. That was a big challenge. But again, you can kind of see this courtyard idea, and some of the things that you begin to see kind of become common in our projects is this idea of these kind of terracing landscapes down to the street. This does a couple folds. Like what you would need to have without those landscape terraces is railing. And one of the things we wanted to get rid of was any railing down to the street level, so you could really try to begin to tie this this idea of the courtyard to the street, even though we weren't able to physically do that. And so you can kind of see that building in plan here, kind of how all the units kind of amass around that courtyard and all kind of face it. And that's the other interesting thing is you'll see, here's just some other images of that courtyard space that's heavily used. Everything actually fronts that. Nothing actually really fronts the street. They all front the courtyard, then the courtyard fronts the street. And so you're just getting some views from that over top. But what's interesting is, so when you look at it from the street level, it really feels like a sculpture. It feels like this kind of sculpture element. And it's kind of funny. You can see a little bit of the sparkle grain we've put into this building. But Larry always said when he opened up, he wanted to be playing Liberace as you walk down, or as you would go down the street, because I mean, it does sparkle in the sunlight when you're walking by. But we were really, again, trying to think about it as a public art piece that people could enjoy. So you're almost living in art. And so that's where these kind of volumes and other things became more volumetric rather than mass. And just some other images kind of showing some of these aspects, where we're even thinking about how we tie the land into the building. And keeping it as simple as possible and as affordable as possible. And so this gets some incredible views. I call it the Pope's pulpit up there at the top. But you have kind of incredible views back to the ocean, but also to the mountains beyond, the mountain range or the hills beyond. Here's another view kind of looking back from that area. And so all of this has kind of coalesced around this idea that we began to pull together through research of this density exhibit that we put on that really allowed for us to kind of explore and analyze and reflect on our own work. And so we did that just like any art gallery or art studio would have these kind of exhibits. We were thinking about the architecture just in that same sense, where from afar, the whole panel you see on that back wall looks like an art piece, but as you start to go to it, it starts to unpack and starts to give you information and begins to become more didactic as a tool to teach the public as well as politicians and other other people in the community about how does good design and housing come about. And so even our projects, we kind of sat on these pedestals, and you kind of see in this one space. And so here's just an image of when you walk up to that and kind of explaining things like density, explaining things of just from a national perspective, but also comparing it specifically to Los Angeles County. And I'm always kind of fascinated, when we get into these conversations, because density always becomes a bad word, but we really need to look at density. Maybe we use a different word, intensity, and some even use that word when they're talking about FAR, floor area ratios. They talk more about the intensity of building uses. But I want to point this out, and this has been an amazing kind of statistic and a report that came out of New Urban News, of all places, back in 2010. But this actually showed what per acre of land produced in annual tax revenue. And so you can see like a county residential all the way to a big box store like Walmart, what they kind of pay to a community, all the way to single family kind of zoning, like the city residential, fast food restaurants, and franchises. But what was interesting is when we were looking at this is mixed use low rise, and that's a critical important element that we really engage in as a firm, because we see this as a kind of missing middle. We see this as where design can be most leveraged, that it doesn't need to be a bedroom warehouse, that you can really still design for privacy and other elements within that building type. But what's important to note is at that point is when the tax base for the buildings and that density start to pay for basic infrastructure. What we don't really always think about in cities is unless we have these 2, 3, and 4-story mixed-use buildings, the type of land use and the tax base that you're getting from that never recoup enough to pay for the basic services like police, fire, water, sewer, let alone fixing potholes. So if you want to know why your streets have potholes, there's a basic ingredient. It's just the way we build at a low density doesn't really allow for us to kind of build on good ways of building community. And I'm always asked this question, and I'm going to touch on this shortly, because even in our community where I'm practicing now, mainly in South Florida, and where a lot of our projects are starting to engage in, we're dealing with issues around resiliency and a question about how do we pay for new infrastructure. And this is something that's critical when a city commissioner or a mayor asks me. It's just like, we need to stop building single family zoning. It's as simple as that to a certain extent, especially within our cities. And starting to think about how do we just make sure we get better design at these kind of scales that can start to pay for the infrastructure that we need. Oop, I don't know why I just did that. That's crazy. It was weird. Cool. But anyways, so I'm just going to touch, and this was one of the things that I'm added. Maybe that's why I wanted to go so fast, is because I added it just here at the end. But I wanted to talk about where we're engaging in South Florida right now on a project that I refer to as salty urbanism. That's its pedestrian term. But it came out of some of the research that I've been doing through the academy, but also with our office in professional practice. And so we're really trying to bridge. And as I was pointing out, like the regulation and policy changes on the housing projects that I was talking at the very beginning, we're trying to do that now also within the broader built environment. And so salty urbanism, again, is a pedestrian term for what projects called ADAPT, and it's an acronym that's a design and planning tool. And so that's for really these coastal areas and how we begin to think about them. But it's doing it again. It's crazy. I hope it doesn't. I'm going to try to advance it a different way next time. Nope, didn't work. I don't know why it's doing that. I apologize. But anyways, I just wanted to put this that came out from Zillow. If we had just 6 feet of sea level rise over the next 50 to 100 years, we're going to have 2 million homes at risk. If you look down to my little state down there, Florida, half of those homes are in that state alone. And so this is really going to become a challenge for us as we start to advance into the next few years. And doing it again. I'm not going to stop that. I don't know why. Well, maybe I just skip it all. But, I put this out because Climate Central put this statistic out of the 25 most at-risk cities in the country. And what's interesting is there's only 2 outside of Florida. There's Atlantic City, New Jersey, and New York, New York. The rest of them are all in there. My hometown right now is number 8. And so we're not boding too well from the standpoint of what the next climate crisis is going to be giving us in South Florida. And this is going to skip, I can tell you right now. See? Yep. But, the point is, and I'll advance it, we're having all these challenges. There's the seasonal high tides that happen that we call king tides. There's also the funny thing is sorry, I'm going to just have to, but we go ahead, this is the roadway during times right now. We're actually getting one of these king tide events. This is just where it's an abnormally higher tide. The streets do this, and then just like what you would typically see with boats, we put these signs out now, like idle speed, 5 miles per hour. And it's funny, there's a guy that owned a Ferrari that started suing the city of Fort Lauderdale, saying that they ruined his Ferrari because he drives through salt water. And anyways, it went into this huge thing. Ultimately, it was an act of God. They couldn't, be sued for it, the city was, and the guy just got, angry and moved away. But the funny thing is when you're in these communities that are very susceptible, Fort Lauderdale is going to have to figure out how to adapt. And, interestingly enough, Fort Lauderdale always is kind of the backheaded or redheaded stepchild to Miami. And specifically Miami Beach gets a lot of the attention, but Fort Lauderdale is even lower and has a lot of these basic issues. So it's going to jump through that. But, this is just a storm surge like we saw with Irma. This is something that we could pretty much see on Ian if it gets close enough or elsewhere. And so I am trying to get back home at some point. But, this is kind of the interesting thing, and I, again, apologize for that. But, we had just spent about $30 million renourishing our beaches before Hurricane Irma. And this is what happened about 3 months after that renourishment. The reason it happened is because we got rid of all of the dunes, which are essentially root dunes. We call them sand dunes, but let's call them really what they should be called as root dunes, because the roots are actually what holds the mass of there. And all this sand came about 2 to 3 feet of it over onto A1A. This sand could not be picked up and put back on the beach because now it picked up all these hydrocarbons and became a toxic or carcinogenic mess and actually had to go to a landfill. you can see, like, it's how we spend money and how we think about these things that are going to become challenges in the future. And so, part of this project was to really think about, not necessarily inventing new ways, but how do we think about the way that natural systems used to work in this community. And so, it was just a Hurricane Harvey. This was 7 inches of rainfall that fell in an hour period of time in South Florida, and you can kind of see the devastating kind of aspects area. Oh, gosh. All right, I'm getting sick of it. But anyways, so this is the kind of iconic coastline of Florida, and you can kind of see here, and what we're just trying to project is what 6 feet of sea level rise would look like in South Florida. That's permanent inundation. Essentially, South Florida, Miami, Fort Lauderdale becomes the upper Keys. If you've ever been down to the Keys, it's going to be fantastic fishing. If we can figure out how to not let the built environment become a toxic mess because of the flooding and everything. But, this is going to be a challenge. And so one of the things that we asked in this project was, if this is what is truly happening, and let's think about a scenario vision for it, is let's not think about this as a problem, but let's think about it as an opportunity. How do we begin to think about future heat, future flooding in a different, more creative way that allows for a different lifestyle to emerge, one that may live on with and over water? And so that was a series of workshops that we've really, and exhibitions that we kind of curated throughout the communities to have this kind of long conversation about what this could be. And then there was collaborations in different design studios at USC, at University of Southern California, as well as University of Kansas, at Florida Atlantic University, that all kind of collaborated developing this with multiple design or architecture firms like our firm to kind of coalesce around this and kind of look at a vision. Wow, I don't know why it's doing this now. Now I'm getting angry. Sorry. Well, let me do something else here. Sorry. Let me just see if resetting it works. Nope. All right. Oh, boy. Yeah, this is not the one I wanted. Apologize, having technical difficulties. Yeah, I'm going to try to just do it as best I can like this, folks. Sorry. So, what this really wanted to be was a new methodology and a framework for how this kind of idea of salty urbanism could coalesce around 5 different elements. And those elements began to become, one, an adaptation toolbox around these, what we call watershed urbanisms. Like, how do we begin to think about the built environment that was there now, and how do we begin to kind of develop and think about retrofitting that, as well as new developments that may be coming in the future. And so how do, again, you live on, with, and over water? How do you create floating structures, or how do you move things to higher ground and other elements? So we would begin to think about that. And then we created a second toolbox, which was just looking at forensic ecology, trying to figure out what was once there before. And so we understood the hydrology, ecology, and the geology of those specific areas. In this case, it happened to be the barrier island that we were working with. And then the third toolkit was looking at what kind of infrastructure adaptation technologies that we had at our disposal that we could really begin to explore and utilize. And so this just happened to be, let me just try to get this as big as I can get it. And so we had things like living shoreline, getting breakwaters, other elements that were just commonplace things. So there's nothing kind of novel about this. What was novel was putting it all together as one integrated kind of system. And so the fourth toolbox was looking at a saltwater plant palette. Like, these were the only plants that are going to thrive come the time that we would go ahead and be inundated with salt water. And so these were, that kind of long display. And this is kind of the one, whenever I present this to the communities in South Florida, you always have the residential or the people that own homes like taking photos real fast of this. And they're like, okay, which plants do I plant? Because it's literally happening right now, where you have communities and homeowners going out and hosing their lawns with fresh water 2 times a day right now because of the saltwater tidal and inundation that happens. And in order to keep their plants alive, they're hosing them down using tremendous amounts of potable water to do that. And then the 5th toolbox and final one was this looking at how do we begin to do flood adaptive architecture, and everything from abandonment, where we think about the materials that are in the ground. So if we did flood, we could just leave it and let it go in place, right? And so the materials that we put into that really need to be considered at that point, because you don't want carcinogens, toxins, or things that really breed bad stuff. But you can actually couple that with landscape architectural elements or phytoremediation to begin to think about how you clean that environment up over a long period of time, all the way to things like floating structures that we would have on that far right-hand side, and everything kind of in between was developed in that. And so we started to look at material tables, and this became critically important. It's something that we're working now, even in our office, is if anybody's ever seen these images, you probably don't have too much of this here, but we see this a lot, spalling out of concrete, because the rebar that we use is steel inside the concrete, and if it doesn't have the proper coverage, starts to basically break off and expose that. And that's when you came into challenges that they're now pointing to. If you go and know Surfside, this is one of the things that they're saying now happen. More and more evidence is coming about that there was a weakening due to the rebar and the kind of exposure and the erosion of that rebar and the fluctuation. Rebar is great if it's totally submerged all the time, or if it never gets submerged at all. The problem is now we're having sea level rise or higher rising seas, and that inundation is starting to happen in a lot of these basements and the foundations of buildings. And so you're going to start to see this becoming more and more prevalent in South Florida, unfortunately. And this is why we go through 40-year certifications and recertifications of buildings now. And now that law is even changing. Just like after Hurricane Andrew, we had a radically new law, or new Florida building code, that hardened our buildings to withstand major hurricane events up to 185 miles per hour. We're now seeing buildings and the designs of them having to look at innovative new materials. Ironically, and I'm going to show some buildings here coming up, but we are looking at fiberglass or basalt reinforcing as alternatives to this, but it's not allowed currently in our Florida building code. And so we're having to go back to the Florida Building Commission as well as to Tallahassee over and over to ask for these ability to kind of design the buildings more resilient. Because ironically, we're designing buildings to handle flooding, to flow through. But the long-term effects of this corrosion and erosion, especially as we get to hotter temperatures, only further exacerbates or accelerates the chemistry or the chemical erosion of that concrete or the rebar in the concrete. So this is downtown Fort Lauderdale and the beach and everything. This is what's going to happen under 6 feet. Again, permanent inundation of the downtown, and this is why I always say that Fort Lauderdale is kind of the redheaded stepchild. It never gets the attention, but you can kind of see that ridge, or this coastal ridge that's left. And so what we started to explore is this little area called North Beach Village, and how we began to think about adaptations activities there. And that was really a good spot because it was on the barrier island. It also had the highest elevation in Fort Lauderdale, or at least one of the highest, at 14 feet, right up against the beach, to one of the lowest elevations at 2 foot above sea level on the western side. And so you're seeing what's projected over here is at 6 feet. So the whole western edge of that community, or that lower half, gets completely inundated permanently at that 6 foot of sea level rise. And so what we were coming up with was strategies to look at how do we begin to, what do we do for the next 10 years? And so we worked with the city of Fort Lauderdale, with students, with faculty, with professionals, to start to say, how do we begin to think about botanizing the asphalt of North Beach Village, what we called it? They had huge amounts of impervious surface. In some cases, it's about 90% impervious surface in this neighborhood alone. That was with rooftops and the asphalt around it. And so what we wanted to look at was what the city, had to do first, and how they could become role models and best practices, and showing low-impact development features like rain gardens, bioswales, salt gardens, and these other kind of types of landscapes that we could integrate in. And then over time, in that 1, 2, and 3, it could be what the private practice could do, and they could choose one of those. But one was like a green jacket, kind of how do we armor around the outside edge. The second one was just moving away from most vulnerable areas. And then the third was taking what they branded Fort Lauderdale as the Venice of America and taking them for their words and actually creating a kind of island district and edge. And so we started to look at this. This is just one of those typical streets that you see on the top image, and then what we were thinking about and then kind of integrating some of those landscape elements into this. And I always say on that top image, you could land a 747 jet on this street, and there's like zero amount of like there's no reason for a 4-lane kind of highway arterial going through this, because the terminated vista there is actually of one of the pioneer homes that will never be kind of developed. And so what we were looking at is kind of developing the shade street that would go ahead and allow for more walkability in there. And you're seeing that on the edge. And I always point this thing out because one of the things that I am talking to a lot to cities and especially to AASHTO and these other organizations like the American Highway Transportation Officials. I mean, has anybody ever read the Green Book from the American Society of Highway and Transportation Officials? Thank you. It's good bedtime reading. It's called the Green Book, and it's actually the document that governs the design of our streets throughout the United States. It doesn't matter really where you are. But the Green Book is only ironically called green because it's nothing about sustainability or green practices, okay? It was just because they didn't have any other color available the day into the printer, and the printer said, hey, I got green. And they're like, that's great. So it became known as the Green Book. But in the Green Book, they call trees FHOs, fixed and hazardous objects. They call sidewalks auto recovery lanes. So it doesn't bode well for pedestrians in this book. And so you can kind of see the top image here is of the Garden District in New Orleans. I mean, most of you probably have been there, seen this. I mean, it's an amazing street and kind of showing you 150 feet from you get trees, you get mass transit, you get the ability to walk and kind of shade infrastructure. I mean, here's what modern codes have done. They've diminished both urban and ecosystem services within our built environment. And this could be anywhere. It happens to be Arkansas, but it could be anywhere. I mean, you can probably drive 15 miles outside of town here and probably find a development kind of like this. But I always find these places interesting because you know when it's garbage day, right? You know, all the garbage cans are out there. But you can see it's like they got rid of all the trees because they were FHOs because, you know, clearly there's somebody that's going to be driving pretty fast down these. But it's become a real challenge working through communities on these aspects. And so this was one of our missions, was just kind of talking to the city how to begin to think about the streets in a very different way with green infrastructure, with ecological infrastructure versus the kind of typical hard or gray infrastructure. And even thinking about the larger community. And if anybody's ever tried to get a permit through the Army Corps of Engineers, it is like getting a federal act of Congress done. I mean, it takes, if you went into a navigable waterway, it literally, you could be there for 10 years trying to get a permit to do anything in the waterway, in that navigable waterway. So one of the things we had to talk to the community about was giving up the 300 feet next to the waterway of their built area and retracting it in to kind of create this green jacket. And where we saw the 300 feet coming from is because we could really begin to absorb a lot of storm surge and deal with a lot of wave energy and other things, as well as create some living shoreline edge that also elevated a lot of the real estate development or the economics of the real estate in the sense of it raised the land values around there. And so that was an interesting aspect, and just kind of showing that it doesn't mean that you couldn't build architecture in some of those zones. It just means you built differently. You'd have these kind of elevated structures or buoyant kind of docks that could go ahead and be there, where maybe you pulled up with a boat rather than a car. And then we had the second one, strategic retreat, where we're from that western most vulnerable area and kind of redeveloping it as a mangrove forest, but also kind of transferring development rights to the higher ground that was at the ridge. And these were just some of the things that we could begin to look at and investigate and kind of develop on that that side of things. And then, you know, one of the things that we found just working with some of the scientists and ecologists was like wading birds, like these birds that we all see as iconic in South Florida, like the egret, the anhinga, and others, were going to be decimated and eradicated because their habitats would basically cease to exist because as rising seas, it would happen too fast. So that's why we had to have these kind of floating grassland habitats through there that would actually allow for it. But we could also have amphibious architecture or floating architecture in there. And everybody always asks me, how do we deal with the Florida state bird, the mosquito? And we were like, well, there is ways, because it's one of the reasons we got rid of all these mangrove forests throughout South Florida was because of the mosquito. And then obviously, you know, or have probably heard about Zika and other kind of airborne diseases that could easily be transmitted by these guys. We began to like look at how do we kind of deal with mosquito management through purple martin bat houses, but also as dragonfly habitat. Dragonflies, ironically, eat more larvae of mosquitoes than any other insect, apparently. And so we were trying to say, here's what you would need to begin to cultivate. And then you can kind of see the sand dunes coming back, or those root dunes, as I was mentioning on that lower image, and thinking about even sand engines coming back to that kind of area. And then the third and final one was that, again, that kind of America, this land adjustment, which had the kind of duality of both urban and ecosystem services, that the fact that it was urban, it created economic kind of benefits and higher costs of some of the properties along the water's edge, but ecological because it had the more surface area or the more shoreline edge you have, the more ecological services you could have in there. And so, you know, this is where some of the students started investigating like architecture and how you can kind of raise that up over time as the seas would rise. They can kind of work through that. And we came up with an ecotypic framework. We started to look at a design and construction manual for the city of Fort Lauderdale. It was ironic because it's just recently been codified, but it's actually for their entire public realm that Brooks Scarpa did. But it's called the Fast Forward Fort Lauderdale Design and Construction Manual for a Sustainable and Resilient Community and Cohesive Public Realm. That was a long-winded title I always loved saying, and I always have to say it because I remembered it. But, you know, we call it the DCM for short. But this was one that was really to help them kind of spearhead how they looked at open space, streets, frontage, parcels. And I'm just going to kind of move through these things pretty quick here. But we were looking at open space. We were looking at how to begin to plan and kind of design for that. But also, just like you saw in the previous example of the Salty Urbanism Project, we started to show how these kind of root dunes, living shoreline, and other elements could work, what their costs were, what their purposes was, to really give a tool for the entire city. Because it's ironic, if anybody's ever worked with a city, you usually work with a singular department. And that department doesn't talk to the other department, who doesn't talk to the other department. And so this manual was not for the public. This manual was just for the departments to talk to one another and begin to develop their same language, a cohesive language across them, and even talking about how do we kind of promote place and identity, healthy and active lifestyles, focused development, flood protection, and flood and heat protection, I could say, in that through across the public realm, specifically in streets as well as other parks and other parcels. And so we kind of developed, again, examples for them to look at and how to design for those FHOs. So how do we design for urban street trees? If most of you may or may not know this, but the average lifespan of an urban street tree is only 7 years. And usually that's because we don't design for them correctly. And usually the landscape maintenance programs are much more healthy budgets than landscape programs in most cities. And so that's a huge kind of issue if we start to see landscape no more as ornament, but more as infrastructure. I think that's a tremendous windfall that we're going to start to see moving forward, as that landscape must become infrastructure in our cities. And so, you know, we just, again, explained a lot of these different things, but then started tying it back to policies around architecture, but even to talk about how do we begin to design architecture in the public realm to coalesce around these projected rising seas. And so even just doing dumb things like changing the way we built the first floor heights from 15 feet and going to 20 feet, we immediately could build in 5 feet of adaptation. When a street had to be raised, the building could then be raised also without having to raise the building. You just raise the ground floor inside that building. And so coming up with concepts like that are now becoming part of the zoning code in Fort Lauderdale as well as Miami Beach. And so we put it all together in this kind of book. And so I'm going to kind of end the talk kind of where we're at today. And we're doing about 139 units of senior affordable housing amongst 3 different projects in Miami Beach. They just all happen to be on basically 2 man-made islands. Normandy Isle, you can see the pattern of it. And it's just called Normandy Isles because there was, I guess, a French developer that came in and thought, you know, we'll name every street Marseille, or Rue, and we'll just kind of have, you know, a cool day, right? And so this was 1920s, 30s that this was built. and it's one of the more susceptible areas to sea level rise today. And so when we were tasked with these projects coming to it, it was like, how do we begin to think about, one, the architecture, the historic architecture that was once there. It's mid-century modernism. That's just pretty ubiquitous in this area of Miami Beach, because this is North Beach. Most of you probably know the iconic South Beach, the Art Deco kind of wall of the 1930s. Well, most of the rest of Miami Beach was built in the 50s and 60s after World War II. And this was the kind of architecture of the place there. And so this is literally the courtyard building that's about 2 courtyards or 2 properties down from us. And so we were like, how do we begin to design and think about in that same similar element? And then you do see this iconic kind of Art Deco. But the reason I show this is I was always fascinated growing up in Miami. And when I first got to see an Andy Sweet exhibit, how many of you have ever watched the kind of documentary, The Last Resort? I mean, it's all on Andy Sweet's photographs, which unfortunately he was brutally murdered in his 20s. But he would go around Miami Beach in the 70s and take all these photos when Miami Beach was primarily an elderly community. It was a retirement community. And so you have all these kind of great kind of porchscape photos of elderly people hanging out on these porches, kind of surveying. And so this became kind of another one of those kind of motifs, or a concept that we wanted to kind of pull into these projects. And we were also fascinated with the Miami Beach Red, which is technically pink, but they call it Miami Beach Red. But we really liked those kind of aspects in that breeze block, again, this kind of vernacular style. And so we kind of coalesced all that around into what is essentially a dumb box with what I would call a great wraparound porch and a great kind of skin. And this is the sketch that Carl showed. It's also a few sketches I gave. You did get the only sketch of another building today, but that's okay. But this is a kind of aerial shot of it, but you can see this is called the Heron. And it's 20 units of elderly affordable housing. And so the ground level, interestingly enough, is just a parking area and a porch. And the upper 3 levels are where the housing is, and then there's a community room on that 4th level where you see the kind of planting. And so we really were thinking about how do we also create kind of walkability. It's an elderly, disabled elderly at that. How do we get them to possibly not use the elevator? So we kind of strategically design the stairs and everything just behind that breeze block kind of element you see on that left-hand side there to, again, encourage this kind of walking up and down what we saw as a kind of social stair, as a kind of social street for the community that would move from that community center down to the ground. And so this is kind of what it looks like in section. You're kind of looking back beyond that skin that was shown before and kind of reverse, but you can kind of see the breeze block. You see the studio units, and these are all, again, micro units, has that community room. But I point this out because this is our current sea level on the site. That's at 3 feet, that's at 6 feet, and then if we have a storm event with that 6 feet, you can kind of see it goes right up to the bottom side of those units. And so this is why it becomes so critical to begin to bake this adaptation. And one of the things I didn't really talk about was we have a unified sea level rise projection down in South Florida that takes all 4 counties, Monroe, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach, and kind of unifies around where we see these projections going. And so we're also now having to design for any infrastructure. It has a lifespan of 50 years. It typically takes 5 to 10 years to get it built. So if you're designing a project, you need to be thinking 60 years into the future, if that's going to be the lifespan of that project. And so it was ironic because we asked the city of Miami Beach, as well as the city of Fort Lauderdale, how much sea level rise were they planning to when they were designing their infrastructure, and they said 1 foot. And I was like, by the end of all this stuff, they're now taking it more serious. But and you're starting to see more and more evidence of these kind of rising seas. But the problem is that it doesn't matter whether the seas, first of all, it's not a belief; it's a fact. Seas are rising. We're seeing that it's trending over the last 50 years. It's about 10 inches, and it's just accelerating. So we're starting to see this kind of exponential curve on it in South Florida. And it's episodic and it's cyclical. So it may not be as bad one year as it's going to be the next year. And then we got these kind of, when you look at moon cycles and all these other things, it's really, you have to kind of correlate it over the entire element. But what we also have is more intense, less frequent storms. So we're getting a lot more rainfall like you probably are having here. and more and less events, but more extreme. And so that's kind of, again, compounding these kind of flooding issues that we have to design for more storm surge, more flooding, even with that. And so this is just kind of some of the images of what it looks behind that. And so we, again, are kind of playing up this kind of Miami Beach red, this kind of pink aesthetic in here, very classic of Miami Beach. And this is the kind of image of that front facade. And so we're really being cognizant of this kind of scalloped stairs and this kind of terracing stair, again, where people can hang out, kind of, like an old stoop. But there's also some other elements, but we're really trying to make and dress the building to have at least some street presence, but also kind of shading it and other elements like that. And so you can, again, kind of see this. And one of the critical aspects is we have to design this building to accommodate the street is going to be raised to 5 feet and over the next 10 years. That street is going to move up 5 feet. So the building had to be kind of designed to mitigate what the city's going to eventually build it up and kind of tie it in. And so what we've kind of planned for is that happens right there at that kind of terraced level. So it almost feels like it was meant to be when the street actually gets raised. And so there was a lot of different challenges we had for that. And then just some of the last projects I'm going to talk about is the Vista and the Breeze project, which is on Miami Beach again in the same neighborhood. And it's 2 different projects, 119 units, but the Breeze is 70 units, and it actually is located on the water. But we kind of took it on to be similar to the city of Miami Beach kind of vernacular of these courtyards, and just like the courtyards I was talking about from Los Angeles, and kind of built it and flood adapted it by building that courtyard up to the 2nd level, much like some of those Los Angeles projects where you actually have tuck under parking below. And so this is that courtyard level again. Kind of can see how the units kind of aggregate some of the sections through that, and where we're really thinking about the crenellation and the kind of massing and some of the volume and how you kind of read that from the street scale, because this is where one of those NIMBY bananas neighborhoods was too. And so we were really trying to kind of work out some of those notions, but we even were like developing a landscape palette for that, and something that we really wanted to advance is the ASLA butterfly, which is this kind of endangered butterfly that thrives on this Kunti type plant. We wanted to make sure we integrated that to kind of build on and kind of make sure that we were providing habitat. This is what the interesting, and this is like one of the last stories I'm telling, but this was the seawall as it currently exists on this property. You can see it's probably seen better days, but it's pretty much failing. It's getting undercut from the backside. That deck actually becomes a sunbathing area for massive iguanas. And you have a few green buttonwoods over there, which operate kind of like mangrove. And so one of the things that we were trying to do is we had to build a new seawall. We couldn't afford that. And 2, as I was mentioning, we would also have to get a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers and how long that could take. So what we decided to do was give back 10 feet of the land to the waterway. We're going to build the new seawall 10 feet in, and then let the old seawall just kind of fail gracefully and let it become this kind of littoral shelf for a tidal garden. And so that's what that kind of tidal garden would look like over time. And you can see some of the existing fabric next to us and how we're just trying to adjust as best we can, kind of dealing with what is the future climate crisis coming there. And really, again, looking at how that the landscape and the architecture begin to kind of work together as one kind of cohesive unit. And then we have the Vista project, which is across the street, similar in scale and courtyard, but this is about 49 units. Again, another courtyard building, and then the kind of view from above, kind of looking back at the street and how that's going to come in. But just again, pointing out to this is like they're going to come in and raise this street too, about 5 feet, and so it kind of hits that same kind of mid-platform on the walkway or these stairs too. So you can see we're 10 feet above street level on these, and so we're really trying to mitigate this kind of idea of how do you get people up there, how do you kind of work through this. And so, here's the other image from the other unit, but you can see the 2 projects are kind of catty-cornered to each other. And that's it. I appreciate it. Thank you. Questions? I know I went a little long. Well, yeah, there's a ton of people dealing with, especially after Hurricane Sandy. There's so many different projects, but they have a completely different issues than we have. I mean, we live on a porous limestone substrate in South Florida, which is basically, Swiss cheese. Water just comes up through it. There they live on granite, and they live on clay, so it's got a little bit more of impermeable kind of action. So what you really have to kind of worry about is the edge condition there, where we have to kind of worry about lifting up and out of the way, because there's no amount of edge that we're going to be able to kind of really get, even though you want to have that, because evapotranspiration, other things that you can kind of take advantage of with the infrastructure that we have. The problem is in South Florida, in most tropical environments, there's not a lot of research or data done to how much evapotranspiration and things like that we can get, whereas a place like New York that's in a temperate climate has a tremendous amount of information and study on those kind of plants. So, that's one of the things that, I'm working with ecologists right now that we're trying to kind of advance some of those kind of studies. Yes. Carefully. No, I mean, it's a great question. I think you can probably see from this lecture, like our biggest issues when we take on projects, we want to, we take on the projects we feel are best suited for what we think we can best serve. And I just say that in a very literal sense, that some communities, and unfortunately in South Florida, ironically, there's going to be winners and losers, unfortunately, and that's a hard debate and a hard conversation to have. But when you have them, like the city of Fort Lauderdale that we did that design manual for, there are in offices maps of neighborhoods that are going to be cut off from basic services like sewer and water, and they won't be able to also provide fire and police services to some of these that are going to be, it's the new form of redlining that's going to be happening, and unfortunately nobody wants to be that political, the guinea pig in that, so to speak. And so you're having extreme issues in Fort Lauderdale, but unlike Fort Lauderdale, Miami also is having extreme issues. But in Miami, least vulnerable neighborhoods are the ones that were the most vulnerable populations over time. They are historically the neighborhoods that are now having a tremendous amount of development coming into them. And how do you begin to think about climate gentrification, and how do you protect and manage residents that have historically lived in these communities for decades and maintain a thriving in a livable as well as an affordable place for them. So we're working with communities like Little Haiti also, and starting to do things with them, as well as Overtown in Miami. Miami Beach, where I showed these projects, ironically is the most affordable areas on Miami Beach. It's some of the most need of housing. The projects I showed you at the end were elderly affordable housing. And why we're doing elderly, it's because we're not required to do parking. However, we couldn't develop the housing without parking, ironically. The communities, there was so much NIMBYism in the bananas that they did not want us putting that many residents on the street, even though the Housing Authority's director told them only 20% of their residents own automobiles. They didn't believe us. They required us to put 50% 50% parking for the amount of units we had, like at least 50% of what's required by code. So that's why we put it all at the ground level and basically make that a sacrificial kind of layer. But yeah, it's a struggle. Yes. I'm glad you asked that question. If I had like a whole nother lecture, I would show you, because our own office building that we purchased is an old warehouse in a floodplain, and we designed it in a flood adaptive way. I actually designed it Ironically, if you put more than 50% of the depreciated value of your building into a renovation project in South Florida, you have to bring the whole building up to code, which means essentially, if you're in a floodplain, you have to build the building up because housing is not allowed to be in the floodplain. You actually have to raise up the first occupiable level 1 foot above base flood elevation, called design flood elevation. And it depends on which communities you're in. But commercial buildings can be below that, but then you have to have flood dams, and that can be very expensive. So what we designed our building was to let it flood the 2 feet that could flood in there. And so we have wood panels. I bought an old warehouse. I mean, so we built all the furniture, like it's actually stanchioned off the wall. So like there's nothing within the first 18 inches that it could flood, and we could just flip over the desks onto that built-on desk. I can take all these panels, these wood panels that we have, plywood panels, which are all screwed into place, and take them off just to prevent that. And so, you know, it's an interesting question, but there is ways to adapt existing buildings, and you're seeing more and more of that being done, where first floors are becoming basements, so to speak, on these older, more historic buildings, especially. Interestingly enough, like in Hollywood, Florida, we're working in there, and they are actually raising a lot of their historic buildings. But that comes with a considerable cost. And then the historic preservation at the state level as well as federal level doesn't allow you to build it more than 1 foot above base flood elevation. So some of these historic buildings want to build higher, make them where they, because I will just tell you that FEMA regulations don't currently adjust for sea level rise. They're only for the flooding, storm flooding. Like they're not for future sea level. So that becomes a lot of the communities want to build for future sea level rise, but they're not actually allowed to do that in some cases right now. Another question? So some of them are nonprofit organizations. Some of them are governmental organizations. Like I'll just talk specifically about the last three particularly. So the Heron was done for the Housing Authority of the City of Miami Beach, which is essentially a quasi-City of Miami Beach governmental authority. Interestingly enough, we're in a historic district, and I didn't say it, and I don't want to say it, but Gilbert Fine, who was a prominent architect in Miami Beach that built a lot of housing across there, we're actually demolishing one of his contributing structures for the Heron. It's not a thing I'm proud of, but we wanted to make sure we put back something that was worthwhile and architecturally would contribute, even though it was a non-contributing structure, would contribute to the fabric, to the way that that district reads. His building happened to be also, it was a half a courtyard building, so it was missing its twin. So we kind of made the case. There was 3 more courtyard housing projects of the same exact type of building right next to us. We just said, look, we're going to tear this one down because, one, they're building a 4-story housing project right next to us that's on a vacant property, and then we have the Gilbert Fine property. And so one of the things that we were really exploring with those kind of curved masses forms was kind of being more appropriate to the massing of that condition of changing that scale for the time being. But with that, we had to go through the Historic Preservation Board, and we were given fully unanimous approval of demolishing the structure as well as full approval of our design, which has never happened in the city of Miami Beach. And so it kind of made us rock stars for a second. So a developer was developing the Vista Breeze project, and so that's a private developer who came to us and asked us to go ahead and shepherd their project through, and that's how we got that. So it's not always, us, sometimes like it was an open call with the Housing Authority. They asked for an architect to come. We pitched an idea, and they chose us. Yep. Yes.
Obviously, as the arena of work changes for the architect as a cultural practitioner, new forms of the architect as a cultural practitioner emerge. Do you guys have those types of conversations? Like Brooks Scarpa, do you think that this is new, that we're hearing from a new breed, if you will, or a new mentality architect? Or do you think this is just what architects have always done and
Well, I don't think it's something new, but I think there's something in our ethos as an office, as a kind of citizen architect. You know, the act that whatever we touch, we want to put back better than when we found it, you know, that kind of attitude. So, you know, that kind of really takes on some of the premise. I mean, it's not to say that the things I'm showing today, I'm not showing you the multi-million-dollar houses that we also do. So we have a very traditional practice on the side of that, but we're still pushing sustainability, resiliency, and those on projects. We do a lot of museums. We do work across the country and across the world. And so what we find unique is just looking at sometimes the ordinary and thinking about it in an extraordinary way, whether that be through material or just way we re-perceive something. But I think first and foremost, we always want to be sustainable, resilient, and kind of think in an adaptation type way. But the citizen architect kind of is something, all three of the principles, and I think the rest of the firm, when people come to work for us, staff, like we want everybody to kind of have that same mindset, where, you know, again, we're always trying to challenge the status quo and kind of being supply side thinkers. You know, I think all too often the profession is demand side. We're like ambulance chasers, just kind of looking for the next project to the next project. But we see each project as the potential of developing a new model, a new way of thinking, and a new way of tying a triple bottom line of sustainability and looking at the economics, the social and environmental aspects that we can really challenge ourselves. And that's why our practice is even expanding from where it was even 10 years ago into more landscape architecture, urban design, and planning, is because, again, we see that as the segue or the kind of next phase in our professional development as a society and as professionals, as designers, is in a metadisciplinary way that we have architects, landscape architects, planners, urban designers, all working with ecologists, working with engineers, all together kind of through these. And so some of the things I didn't even talk about were these projects in Miami Beach. We are starting to look at advancing alternative reinforcing in them, and that's been a huge thing. And I'm, like, you know, having to fight for that. And so we're having to find what I would say is not necessarily smarter structural engineers, but engineers that are up for the challenge of kind of stewarding that. And so we do look for people that are alike. And I find partnerships, like a lot of the projects that I showed today, you know, are not always just Brooks Scarpa alone as the architect. You know, it's collaborations. Sure. Oh, then, sorry. The Fort Lauderdale manual was a commission from the city. I won't tell you how much that cost to develop, but it cost a lot more than we were paid. We usually ask for a nickel and give a dime. Like any architecture firm, I hate to say it, but, you know, when you're passionate and you kind of see, you know, those things. But yes, that was a commissioned project. The work that I was showing in Salty Urbanism had multiple kind of grants tied to it. National Endowment for the Arts, Florida Sea Grant, which is administered through NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And that was what was kind of interesting, and I was actually talking to your dean today about that, is like what I find architecture, landscape architecture's value is bringing to the table the ability to tie science, art, and engineering together, because we're a little bit of all of them, right? And that to me allows for us to kind of explore and kind of look at these opportunities to advance sometimes when they're something that doesn't exist and probably won't ever exist because a municipality doesn't have the money up front for it. You can kind of tie. And so ironically, the Salty Urbanism project, through an academic and professional practice kind of pro bono service, tied into, you know, professional work that could kind of pull out of that for our firm and for other firms. Because I could tell you, we're not doing any of the streetscape designs, but there's tons of engineering firms and other architecture firms and landscape architecture firms that are now doing streetscapes through that whole community that I don't get to do, but more power to them. You know, it's like, that's what's kind of great is and that's why I say it's the supply side kind of thinking, is it's the supply side not only gives it to the public good, but it also gives it to ourselves as a profession to have more projects. And, you know, I hate always saying that the hurricane, which looks like, you know, Florida's about to get, is always the Architects Employment Act, they sometimes call it. But, you know, it's like it doesn't always have to be that way. And I think resiliency and creating resilient communities is going to be a huge thing. I think my computer just died. I think it's telling us something. Thank you.